दिलों में प्यार की खुशबू तो होठों पर दुआ रखना दिलों में प्यार की खुशबू तो होठों पर दुआ रखना ईमान में वक्त से एक रिश्ता इश्क वफा रखना ईमान में वक्त से एक रिश्ता
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, and welcome back to another episode of Friday Sermon for Kids. Today, I am once again joined by two incredible panelists, Haris, Areeb, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
How are you both doing today?
I'm doing great and I feel ready to discuss this week's Friday sermon.
Me too. It's a different topic than last week.
I agree. And the topic we are going to be discussing today is the Jalsa Salana UK, which is who talked about in this week's Friday sermon.
Jalsa is an important event, so discussing in more detail would be great.
That is right. But before we get into this discussion, I think it's a good idea to listen to a clip from this week's Friday sermon.
अल्लाह ताला के फजल से आज जलसा सालाना बरतानिया शुरू हो रहा है और अल्लाह ताला के फजल से हज़ारों लोग यहाँ दीनी और रूहानी माहौल से फ़ायदा उठाने के लिए आए हैं। इन दिनों में यहाँ हदीक़तुल महदी में एक आर्ज़ी शहर बनाया गया ताकि इस माहौल में रहकर हम दुनियावी झमेलों से अलहदा होकर अपनी दीनी, रूहानी, अखलाकी हालतों को बेहतर करने की कोशिश करें।
It seems that you both listened to the Friday sermon, and I'm sure that you learned something as well. So, why don't you both tell me what you learned?
Something that I learned from this week's Friday sermon was that Huzoor, may Allah be his helper, mentioned that the Jalsa Salana is a place where you focus on your spirituality and you get to learn more.
I learned that Huzoor has put great emphasis on treating the guests of Jalsa Salana well, as it reflects on the Jamaat as a whole.
Very well done to the both of you. Now I think now would be a great time to start our discussion. So Huzoor started his Friday sermon by talking about and introducing the Jalsa Salana UK to all of the guests. Huzoor mentioned that the Jalsa would be attended by thousands across the globe. And these thousands of people would be coming to Jalsa to engage in spirituality and benefit from a religious atmosphere. Huzoor also mentioned that the Jalsa Salana site, Hadiqatul Mahdi, would be like a temporary city where people find refuge from worldly matters and step away from all the materialism and the things in the world.
Of course, Jalsa Salana UK is a mega event where people from all around the world come and take part in the Jalsa. A mini city is a great description for Jalsa Salana. And it's so inspiring that the ultimate goal for such a big gathering is a spiritual revival.
I agree. We live in a world where worldly things are really important. But Jalsa Salana takes a leap away from all that. It helps us focus on our prayers, learn and understand our faith, and develop brotherhood. The site is truly amazing, but doesn't it take so much work to make a convention this big?
Yes, that's definitely right. It does take a lot of work. In fact, the assignment of volunteers, the setting up of the booths, and the development of the langar for so many people. Langar, by the way, is the food area. So if thousands of people are coming, of course, the food area has to be massive. So a lot of the time, the planning and the setup for the Jalsa occurs months prior to the actual event. Now, the organization, of course, takes a lot of work and a massive team. So naturally, Huzoor also gave guidance to the volunteers. Huzoor mentioned that the volunteers who have been given duties should complete their duties to their utmost best ability, right? Huzoor also mentioned that the volunteers should consider the guests of the Jalsa as the guests of the promised Messiah ﷺ. As such, these guests must be treated with respect, and anytime any negative behavior, like for example, let's say a guest starts an argument, for example, volunteers, like Huzoor said, should sort of ignore that argument and instead show humbleness, show patience. Huzoor also mentioned that volunteers should also focus on their own spirituality and present themselves as the best possible Muslims they can be during the Jalsa.
I definitely agree. Huzoor mentioned something that I think would be easy for us to understand as volunteers. You see, Huzoor mentioned that the promised Messiah, ﷺ, he said that guests are just like mirrors. They can easily shatter. So that's why we should always take care of them.
Jazakallah Reeb for mentioning that. That's actually a very good way that all the volunteers of Jalsa Salana can sort of remember and understand their roles better. I think now would also be a very good time to take a little bit of a break, right? We'll head into our next segment, Word of the Sermon, where our good friend Ubaidur Rahman will help us better understand the wording that Huzoor used in his Friday sermon. So for that, take it away, my friend.
Jazakallah, guys. So this week's word of the sermon is Garkunan. This is an Urdu word and it was used many times in this week's sermon. Garkunan is the plural form of the word Garkun, which means a worker. So the word Garkunan simply means workers. Huzoor, may Allah be his helper, used this word to refer to all workers, volunteers, and anyone doing duty at Jalsa Salana. Hope that helps. Jalsa Salana Mubarak. Back over to you guys.
Jazakallah Ubaidur Rahman, wonderfully done like always. We appreciate having you explain the wording of the khutbah so that we can better understand what Huzoor is talking about. Now I think it is a good time to get back into our discussion.
Could you discuss more about the guidance Huzoor gave to the attendees of the Jalsa? Because I know for sure that Huzoor talked a lot about that.
Absolutely, that's a great point. Huzoor, like he gave guidance to the volunteers, also gave guidance to the attendees of the Jalsa. Huzoor mentioned that Jalsa Salana is an event that is held for a righteous purpose. So, the attendees should focus on their spirituality and their sort of religious revival. Huzoor also mentioned that, Jalsa isn't a time where you should just focus on meeting with your friends or eating good food or, spending time outside of Jalsa as well. I mean, you could do those any other time of the week, right? Huzoor also mentioned that, Jalsa is not a time where you want to sit around and, engage or waste time on worldly things. Instead, you should actively try to listen to as many speeches as you can and volunteer and help out wherever possible. I know for sure when I was a kid, I would go to Jalsa Salana and I would be the water boy. I would walk around with a water jug giving water to everyone. And that was what I felt like doing. That is precisely what Huzoor himself mentioned as well. That Jalsa is a time where spirituality and religion are the prime focus, and that if guests think that they are worldly guests, Jalsa won't be effective. So if they think of themselves as spiritual guests, then even small shortcomings as well, like small little errors that volunteers may make, can be overlooked and ignored.
That makes sense, because when all the Ahmadi Muslims attend Jalsa just to improve their spirituality, guests and volunteers can attend Jalsa in harmony and no major incidents will occur.
And speaking of major incidents, Huzoor also talked about how attendees should sort of have a sense of humbleness and some patience as well. Huzoor mentioned that the volunteers work very, very hard to ensure that the Jalsa Salana is happening efficiently and that everyone is treated equally and fairly. But, of course, Huzoor mentioned that we are all human, right? Humans make mistakes. So, mistakes are bound to happen. Huzoor states that the Holy Prophet ﷺ said that Muslims or a believer should learn to suppress their anger. As such, if an incident occurs that is sort of emotional, that forces you to get angry, Huzoor says suppress that anger, ignore it. And if you want to give some feedback afterwards, you can definitely do that as well.
Huzoor also mentioned the small incident that happened with the Holy Prophet ﷺ's companions. You see, the Holy Prophet ﷺ's companions, they strived to follow every single command of the Holy Quran. One of the commands were, if a host rejects a guest, the guest should leave their home. And one time, the Holy Prophet ﷺ's companion, he came up to him and said, I wanted to follow this verse, but never got the chance to.
That's right. Huzoor did mention that. And it's actually a really good example of how a guest of a host or wherever should sort of focus their patience and sort of understand their position as a guest. I think now is also another great time to take a little bit of a break, because the next segment is going to be question of the sermon. So I hope you both are ready. It's going to be an interesting one. All right, we are now at the question of the sermon. Like always, I will give you the question and then 10 seconds to come up with your answers. Now here is your question. In his Friday sermon, Huzoor mentioned that the Holy Prophet ﷺ said that a believer should do what to even those they do not know? Option A, say salam. Option B, give them a hug. Option C, smile at them. Or option D, be humble. Your 10 seconds start now. Alrighty, time is up. Why don't you both give me your answers?
I'm going with C, smile.
I'm going with A, salam.
Alright, one of you got it right this time, and it was Arib. Yes, the right answer to the question is that you should say salam to even those you do not know. I think that's why so many people during Jalsa are going around saying salam to random people. Alright, I think it is a good time now to head back into our discussion. So now, near the end of Huzoor's sermon, Huzoor mentioned a very interesting incident during the life of the promised Messiah ﷺ. Huzoor mentioned that during the sort of popular debate that occurred between the Muslims and the Christians, known as Jang-e-Muqaddas, the promised Messiah ﷺ didn't actually get any food at the time. And the reason why this incident is particularly interesting is because, very similar to a Jalsa, there were so many people at this debate that the volunteers actually forgot to give the Prophet Messiah ﷺ any food. Now, it had been quite a while, and the Prophet Messiah ﷺ was quite hungry, and he found some volunteers whom the Prophet Messiah ﷺ asked if there was any food left. The volunteers, after hearing that the Prophet Messiah ﷺ wasn't fed, got so worried. The Prophet Messiah actually was able to see this worry on the volunteers' face, and he said, don't worry, I am okay with even the leftovers. So whatever is left, I'm fine with eating that. So the volunteers promptly came up with a few pieces of bread, and the Prophet Messiah ﷺ ate that bread. Now, the reason why Huzoor mentioned this particular incident is because it serves as such a great example for the guests of Jalsa Salana. You know, the Prophet ﷺ wasn't fed, he was hungry. But despite that, he showed patience and he happily ate what he was given. And that is sort of the humbleness and the patience that the guests should reflect while they are a part of Jalsa as well.
It is important that everyone knows their responsibilities during the Jalsa. Huzoor beautifully highlighted the important responsibilities and things that guests and volunteers should remember.
I agree. Huzoor also highlighted that there will be interesting booths at the Jalsa Salana.
Excellently done. I think the discussion today was a very good one, and it was important that all of the guests and volunteers sort of understand what their roles are. And with that, we come to the end of our discussion. I think it would be a good idea to give our audience a little recap of what we discussed today.
Huzoor mentioned that whenever a person has duties at Jalsa, they should try their best to fulfill those duties while also working towards their spirituality. They should also try not to say any bad words or any negative behavior towards any guests.
We continued our discussion by talking about the guidance Huzoor gave to the guests. He mentioned that they should remain respectful to the volunteers and focus on their spirituality.
And lastly, Huzoor mentioned an incident that occurred during the life of the Prophet Messiah ﷺ that serves as an excellent example for the guests of Jalsa Salana. And with that, we come to the end of this week's episode.
Make sure to watch the full Friday sermon on your own time.
Until next time,
Khuda
Hafiz.
तुमसे मुसलसल राबता रखना, मगर है शर्त तुम उससे मुसलसल राबता रखना। इमाम वक्त से एक रिश्ता इश्क वफा रखना, दिलों में प्यार की खुशबू तो होठों पर दुआ रखना। इमाम वक्त से एक रिश्ता इश्क वफा रखना, इमाम वक्त से एक रिश्ता इश्क वफा रखना।